Morning, welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson, Director. Delighted to be your host here today for this most important keynote address. As many of you know, this is a golden era in terms of the impact and interest in this country for Australian politics and policy, ranging from figures such as the role of Sir Linton Crosby, Isaac Levido, and in policy terms, the advent of Alexander Downer, longest serving Foreign Minister in Australia's history, as our Chair of Trustees, and of course the importance of this topic today with Angus Taylor, Energy Minister, needs no further explication of importance not merely to the Commonwealth of Australia, to the region, and more widely globally. It's also obviously been of political significance in the fates of successive leaders of the Australian Liberal Party and Prime Ministers, but one man who's known how to navigate all of these things, Alexander Downer, as our Chair of Trustees and longest serving Foreign Minister in the country's history, will introduce our guest of honour today. We'll then open up to question and answer session. Usual House rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. There'll be both a virtual and an online audience, so we just urge you all to stick your electronic hands up if you're not here in the live audience today. Alexander, thank you for honouring us here today.
Well, thanks very much, Dean. I just want to say what a great pleasure it is for me as the Chairman of Policy Exchange to introduce Angus Taylor, the Australian Minister for, amongst other things, emissions reductions. And what a privilege it is for us to have the Minister here today. This whole issue of emissions reduction is a huge issue for Australia. And one of the observations I'd make going back to the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol back in the late 1990s is that if you set a single target for the globe, then different countries have to bear different burdens in order to meet those targets. And for Australia, this is a huge challenge to meet the net zero target for 2050. And I think it's an extraordinary thing that the Australian government has worked out a way to do that, which Angus is going to talk about, given the structure of the Australian economy. And for every government, the great challenge here is not only to reduce emissions, but it has other tasks as well to make sure that people's livelihoods are not destroyed in the process. And that is a great balancing act for governments to achieve, and is why this issue is so contentious and so difficult. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the Minister has to say. He is a very distinguished Minister in the Australian Cabinet. He has a very interesting background, both coming from a farming family, but then as somebody who had great academic success. Angus Taylor was a Rhodes Scholar, went to New College, Oxford, if memory serves me well. Since then, he has proved himself very entrepreneurial, working for McKinsey, one of the people who set up a consultancy firm like McKinsey's in Australia called Port Jackson Partners, and then gone into politics and made a great success of politics as well. I would say he was a coming man, but he's kind of arrived already. But he's one of the great leaders of Australia, and I'm very much looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to hearing what he has to say. Thank you very much. Angus.
Well, thanks, Alexander. It's a great pleasure to be introduced by you. Of course, we never served in the Parliament together, but I watched on in my time in business the extraordinary work you did as our longest serving Foreign Minister, and an extremely distinguished one at that. And it's wonderful that you're playing such an important role here in the UK as well as in Australia. So I very much appreciate that introduction. Thank you, Dean, for the opportunity to speak here today at very short notice. The good news is, in this modern world of hybrid meetings like this, we can be both virtual and physical, and it's great to see an audience here and an audience online. So I very much appreciate this opportunity. It's great to be back in the UK. It's been a while for me because of COVID, amongst other things. But I'm always reminded when I'm back here how many good friends we have in Australia here in the UK. And it was great to be up in Glasgow over the last few days talking to many of our good friends from the UK about the work we are doing. It's been particularly good in recent months to conclude the free trade agreement with the UK. As you've come out of Europe, we saw the opportunity to strengthen our relationship, trading relationship and broader relationship with you. And I think it's been a delight that George Brandis, who's here today, our ambassador, has done such good work with my friend and colleague Dan Tehan, working with Vicky Trudell and now Anne-Marie on making sure that free trade agreement is working for both the UK and will work for both the UK and Australia. I still remember the time when the UK joined the EEC. Dan and I shared Dan Tehan and I trade stories on this. We're both from farming families, him from Mansfield, me from a place in the Snowy Mountains, Cooma. So he was the Victorian Alps, I was from the New South Wales Alps. Both from livestock farming families, and it was the early 70s, of course. This was seen as a tragedy for Australian agriculture, that we'd lost access that we'd had to the UK market. It was monumental, and I remember my father saying at the time, this is a profound change, and it's going to take us a long while to come back from it. And it was true. It was absolutely true. So all those years later, to be part of a cabinet, along with Dan, to make a decision to go into a free trade agreement with the UK is one of the better moments I've had in politics, and certainly one of the better moments I've had in the cabinet, to be part of making the decision to move forward with that free trade agreement. So thank you to all of those of you who have been involved and continue to support the great relationship between the UK and Australia, which of course extends well beyond trade to strategic interests, and of course the AUKUS agreement in recent weeks is a good example of how we can work together. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about climate policy. And of course, having just been up at Glasgow and in Rome, where of course it was a big topic of the G20, many people ask me, do you feel optimistic about what you're seeing, what's happening? And my answer is I feel very optimistic. Not necessarily about all the political outcomes. I think this is a very hard graft at the political level. But at the business level, at the technology level, at the financing level, which is what we're seeking to facilitate most of all as a government, I'm very optimistic, because I'm seeing gains being made that are absolutely extraordinary, both in your country and ours. And that's really what I want to talk about today. The Australian approach to bringing down emissions, which is about facilitating the private sector, not pretending that government can do it all, but facilitating the private sector to take a very practical approach to reducing emissions while strengthening our economy. And I think Alexander in his introduction absolutely nailed what the fundamental issue is for Australia, and it's what I'll be talking about today. Now, as Alexander said, the politics of climate change has been far more tortuous in Australia than it has been in the UK. Depending on whose tally you look at, we've lost 6 Prime Ministers over the issue. 6 Prime Ministers over the issue from both sides of politics. Now, people give many reasons for why it has been so difficult, but I think the heart of it is economic circumstances. We are close to unique amongst developed countries in having an economy that is driven by commodity-based exports, particularly energy-based exports, and broader emissions-intensive exports. That's the heart of our export economy. We have growing services, of course, in our exports as well, but those underlying commodity exports are still fundamentally important for Australia, particularly some regions of Australia, including my electorate, which has a strong both resources and agricultural industry. The only other countries that are close to that are Canada and New Zealand. And as I'll say in a moment, they are struggling with the issue just as much as we have in different ways. We are the 4th largest energy exporter in the world. We're global top 3 in agricultural exports and broader resource exports, led by iron ore. And these are supply chains and industries which are extremely difficult to decarbonise. There's no simple, immediate pathway. We can see pathways, I'll talk about those, but no simple, immediate, low-hanging fruit to rapidly decarbonise those industries. But by having this as such a big part of our economy, the consequences of getting policy wrong is dire. And again, Alexander made this point up front. People's livelihoods depend, a large number of people's livelihoods depend on the success of these industries. Now, despite those challenges, Australia's track record is remarkably good. If you look at our performance in emissions reduction since 2005, which is the baseline year for the Paris Agreement, we're down 20.8%. If you compare Canada and New Zealand, other big developed countries, commodity exporters, they've barely moved their emissions since 2005. Ours is down 20.8%. We've grown our economy by 40% or over 40% in that time period. Our commodity product exports have grown by over 200% in that time period. And that performance is not only stronger than, in terms of reductions, than New Zealand and Canada, it's strong, substantially stronger than Japan, than the United States, the OECD average, and obviously China, whose emissions have gone up over 70% in the time that ours have come down by almost 21%. So we're doing something right, and one of the things that we are seeing is an extraordinary uptake in Australia of renewables. 8 times the OECD average. It's world-leading level. We're the biggest user of household solar in the world. Australian roofs, suburban roofs, have become the electricity generators of the 21st century. 1 in 4 houses rising fast. 3 gigawatts of new solar capacity being installed on Australian roofs every year. And 90% of the intellectual property, not just those solar panels, but solar panels across the world, include Australian technology. 90% of the solar panels. Our natural resources give us a great starting point for the challenges that we see ahead. Not only do we have the traditional resources that are well known, coal, gas, uranium, and obviously the use of those will change in the coming years, but we have those other natural resources that are so important in a low carbon economy, water, wind, and of course, above all, sun. We have built some of the most successful commodity supply chains in the world, and we've pioneered those. Starting with Menzies, with the iron ore industry in the 1960s, agricultural industries before that with the UK, of course, but more recently, in recent history, iron ore, coal, and most recently the LNG, the liquefied natural gas industry, where Australia pioneered the development of seaborne shipping of liquefied natural gas, which has become a major global industry. It was Australian technology, Australian know-how, Australian enterprise and entrepreneurship that has built that industry from the ground up. And it's not surprising that we're now one of 3 world leaders in that industry alongside the United States and Qatar. That supply chain in particular is not only creating economic opportunity, it's bringing down emissions in our customer countries. If you're Japan, if you're Korea, buying gas is a way of bringing your emissions down. And Australian gas has been playing an important role in that. But we're not blind to the fact that customer demand isn't going to change, or it will change. There's no question about that over the coming years. And that's the centrepiece of our plan as we look forward to 2050. Customer demand is going to change. Investors' appetite is changing. And we need to adapt our economy, our exports, our competitive advantages to those changes. We want to replicate the success we've seen in our agriculture, resource and energy supply chains in the low emissions supply chains of the future. We've been working on this plan that we've put out this week, or the last couple of weeks, our plan for net zero by 2050 for more than 2 years. We've had to grapple with the difficult economics and politics of getting to net zero by 2050. And we've done it in a way which I firmly believe is consistent with our principles, Australian principles, but also the principles of the Liberal and National Party government, and our values. When I gave our national statement at the previous COP 2 years ago now in Madrid, COP25, I used the opportunity to outline how I saw, even back then 2 years ago, our long-term plan would look and what it would focus on. Ultimately focused on embracing technology. And I said at the time, strong messages and targets alone won't address climate change, no matter how ambitious. The world needs action to reduce emissions, and Australia believes technology is critical to achieving this. So I'm still 2 years later saying exactly the same thing, and I'll talk more about this today, but I've spent the last week in Rome and in Glasgow talking about the importance of a technology-led approach to driving down emissions. The good news is, in that 2 years, many more voices are joining in with this focus on a technology-led approach. Because if we can get the cost of clean energy, fuel sources and technologies down, we can stop talking about raising the cost of traditional fuel sources and traditional technologies. To me, this is the fundamental insight for a commodity-rich country like Australia. This has got to be about bringing the costs down, not raising the cost of traditional fuel sources. So much of this debate has been about wiping out industries, adding costs to industries. It should be focused on the opportunity here of bringing those lower cost energy sources down. Now, make no mistake, whilst I would have thought as someone from the centre-right of politics, this would be pretty obvious, it isn't accepted as universal wisdom. Our longest-serving Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, once asked whether we're for the subordination of the individual to the officialdom of government, or we believe that government is the servant of the people. Well, I think that question is very real in this context. The left in Australia's approach to climate change is revolution, not evolution. A sharp shock, often disguised in Orwellian newspeak as a version of a transition. It's an approach that relies on redistribution, taking from one to give to another, typically through taxation. It relies on aggressive mandates, telling citizens what to do, what kind of transport to use, how to heat their homes, what they should eat, until all that's left is a hollow shell of a once vibrant society. And in its place, obviously, the monolithic modern state that the left has always preferred. Now, whilst that may work in other countries, it's not going to work in Australia, and it's certainly not going to work for this government. It would mean sacrificing jobs, industries and regions. And it's not acceptable to us, or nor would it be acceptable to the communities like mine that we represent. Nor is it palatable, that approach, to the large developing economies in our region. And I think this is a profoundly important point. We live in the fastest growing region in the world. It is aspirational. The people in our region, whether it's in India, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, they want to get to middle class status. They want to get their incomes up. They want to have more opportunities. And imposing costs on them, telling them to do things which is going to slow down the growth of their economies, is never going to be acceptable to them. And that's been very clear in the discussions the Prime Minister and I have had with our neighbours around the Indo-Pacific in recent weeks and indeed in recent months. The thing is, without those countries being part of the solution, there is no solution. Without those countries being part of the solution, there is no solution. You've got to keep in mind that China now accounts for more emissions than the entire OECD, around a third of global emissions. Unless we can decarbonise our aluminium supply chains, our steel supply chains, other heavy industry, refineries, cement, agriculture, in ways that strengthen economies, not weaken them, in ways that raise productivity, not reduce it, we'll fail to achieve the Paris goals, let alone limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, there is an alternative approach, as I've said, to the one being offered by the left. That's one that, as I said, recognises bringing down emissions through reducing the cost of low emissions technologies and fuel sources it is a way of ensuring we raise incomes, raise productivity and raise opportunity in the process. You don't need to needlessly destroy traditional industries or deny a prosperous, happy life and opportunity to people around the world, particularly in developing economies. And solutions that suggest that that's the answer will never be acceptable. Now, whilst the world wants, and rightly wants, action on climate change, and people in Australia rightly want action on climate change, they don't want their lights going off, they don't want their heating going off, they don't want their livelihoods put at risk. But I'm convinced that the entrepreneurs, the investors, the innovators who are focused on those low emissions technologies that are improving dramatically will, with the facilitation and support of government, provide and continue to provide the answers to the problem. The solution isn't in the politicians or the bureaucrats or the activists at COP26. The solution is in those innovators, those entrepreneurs, those businesses that are working on solving the problems, not just identifying them. So our plan is focused on 5 core principles that embody what I've described. The first is technology, not taxes. Technology, not taxes. We don't have a carbon tax in Australia and we won't impose one. But we are deploying technologies at a rapid rate to deliver outcomes. Expanding choices, not imposing mandates. Choice is a good classical liberal value that I believe in firmly, and that has been lost in many ways in modern politics across much of the world. But it matters. Choice matters. And it is central to our approach to this. By bringing down the cost of low emissions technologies and facilitating choice, we'll see businesses and households choose those lower emissions technologies. The third principle is making sure we have a portfolio of technologies that can get us to net zero by 2050. And I'll describe that portfolio as it stands in Australia in a moment, but we laid that out in our technology investment roadmap over 12 months ago. The fourth principle is that we've always got to keep an eye on bringing energy prices down, making sure energy is affordable and reliable. The licence to drive down emissions is lost if people are paying more for their energy bills. We've seen this in Australia. We've seen it on a number of occasions. And so it's absolutely essential we provide that affordable, reliable energy that people rely on for their livelihoods and to manage their cost of living. And then the final principle is to be accountable and transparent for progress. In many ways, I think this has been the most impactful part of Australia getting to, or biggest reason why we've been able to get to emissions reduction of over 20% since 2005, so far ahead of so many other countries. We are transparent in a way that as a minister is at times very difficult, but every quarter, soon after the end of a quarter, like a chief executive with their quarterly reporting, I have to put out Australia's emissions performance in the last quarter by sector, every gas. Every sector, every gas, every quarter. We are the only country in the world that has been consistently doing that for many, many years. And it works. It absolutely works. The Netherlands has just joined us in the last few months, but outside of that, there is no level of transparency as we have it. In fact, China hasn't put out its latest emissions updates for many, many, many years. Now, under the Technology Investment Roadmap we launched last year, we've committed $20 billion to supporting a portfolio of technologies. We're expecting that to bring forward at least $80 billion of total public and private sector investment. The ratio of private sector investment to ours is high and will continue to be high in the coming years. We've set specific goals for a group of technologies that we think are the ones that can drive us to net zero and just as, perhaps more importantly, can drive our region and the world to net zero. Getting the cost of clean hydrogen production to under $2 per kilogram. Driving towards ultra-low cost solar by the early 2030s at less than $15 a megawatt hour. Getting the cost of energy storage to under $100 a megawatt hour to firm up the wind and solar we're seeing going into the Australian grid at record rates. producing green steel and aluminium at costs that are equivalent to the cost of production using traditional blast furnace and smelter technologies. Sequestering carbon at under $20 a tonne, and we've just seen a project committed to by Santos to do exactly that in Moomba, South Australia. And measuring soil carbon across our productive agricultural land, 90 million hectares of it, which is one of the biggest available carbon sinks in the world, being able to measure that at low cost, $3 per hectare per year, in a way that allows farmers to increase the carbon in their soils without having to pay exorbitant costs for measuring it. So getting to cost competitiveness in all of those technologies is the key, and we've seen it work. If you take solar, if you go back to the early 70s, I was seeing the very first solar installations around regional and rural New South Wales where I live. At that point it was a pretty unsophisticated technology. Since that early 70s, we've seen the cost of solar falling on average at 12% a year, year after year after year for 50 years. I mean, this is an extraordinary story with Australian intellectual property from the University of New South Wales and ANU right at the centre of those achievements. The result of that was in the 30 years from the early 70s to the early 2000s, 1 gigawatt of solar was installed worldwide. In the next 10 years, through to 2000, just after 2010, we saw another 10 gigawatts, total of 100 gigawatts. So from 1 to 100. In the last 10 years, we've seen 1,000 gigawatts installed around the world. This is non-linear. Technology, once the costs come down, will be installed because it's a good choice for businesses and households to make, and it happens in a completely non-linear fashion. We need to achieve that across all of these different areas: steel, aluminium, the electricity sector, agriculture, and so on. Now, we know that we can't achieve that alone, and so in the lead up to COP, we've been working hard to form technology partnerships with countries across the world to achieve the outcomes I've described, including with the UK. And it's been a particular pleasure to work with Kwasi Kwarteng, and George has really helped enormously in this process to set up a technology partnership with the UK that allows us to focus on those technologies where we have shared interest, and hydrogen is absolutely central to that. We've backed those partnerships with $565 million of government funding, and we now have partnerships in place not just with the UK but with others including Singapore, Japan, Germany, and more recently South Korea and India. And we're absolutely delighted that the UK is working with us on this. We're also delighted that at Glasgow, the UK is focusing on breakthroughs for these technologies, and I think the focus on the how at future COPs will be increasingly important. Ultimately, though, the solution to this challenge has to be politically and economically sustainable. Solutions that raise costs, that impose on consumers in ways that they won't accept over a sustained period of time are not solutions. And as classical liberals and conservatives on the centre right of politics in Australia, we have to stay true to those fundamental values of customer choice, of technology being an engine of prosperity, and of ensuring that we deploy that bottom-up enterprise and entrepreneurship that's been so central to delivering prosperity for our countries and for the world for so long. As the Prime Minister put it last week, the challenge from here is not what, we've got a little a dog here trying to get in. The challenge for future COPs is not whether we should be ambitious. We're ambitious across the world. People want to solve this problem. The challenge for future COPs is how. And what we've laid out in the Australian plan to get to net zero 2050 is our version of how, which we think has potential to have real impacts, not just in Australia, but across the world. Thank you again, Dean, for the opportunity to speak here. I'm very, very happy to take some questions.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you're going to have to move move slightly to this side.
This side.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Do I see any takers on questions? Ed Burkitt, distinguished senior fellow here for energy environment issues.
Hi there,
transformative part in
Ed Burkitt
debate.
from Policy Exchange. So there are clearly lots of technologies that will be cheaper than the current technologies like solar and potentially electric vehicles. But there are some technologies that are always going to remain more expensive. So if you're running a gas power plant with carbon capture, that will always be more expensive than one without. For those sectors where it will cost more to go low carbon, what is Australia's plan to get the emissions out of those sectors?
So a couple of things I'd say. I think that is not as clear as some often think it is. And let me give you two examples of that. If you look at alum cycle gas generators, they're on a pathway to potentially being more productive than a traditional gas generator, despite the fact that they're using sequestration. Second example is soil carbon in agriculture. It turns out that soil carbon is highly correlated with productivity, and investment in regenerating your soils, which have been run down over an extended period of time, and that's true. We've got very fragile soils in Australia that have been run down. Not only can raise your soil carbon levels, it can raise your productivity. So I think there's more opportunity for those offset type technologies to be net economically productive, not just net zero in terms of emissions, than many people think. That being said, we do have an incentive-based mechanism in Australia. It's an incentive, not a penalty, and this has been an important part of our policy framework for a number of years, called the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is broadening out. It's now been extended into a voluntary market where corporates who are making commitments to targets can buy credits to offset their emissions. And we're seeing the oil and gas companies, the airlines and so on, starting to buy credits at a rate that they haven't in the past. It's really crucial. If businesses are going to make commitments, they need to be transparent. So there is an incentive-based mechanism which is particularly important for some of those areas where you are inevitably adding some cost, to your point.
Great. Lady there, if you say name and organisation. We've got a microphone just coming to you now. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine McBride. I'm from the Centre for Brexit Policy. Are you paying farmers for sequestered carbon, and could you convince the UK to follow that? And B, what did you think of the former Governor of the Bank of England who doesn't think people should be investing in any kind of fossil fuel technology, which obviously is going to cut into your program?
So two very good questions. Let me start with the first. Yes, we are, is the simple answer. Although increasingly those credits are being purchased on the private market, and we want to see more of that. I mean, some people say voluntary markets, that's terrible. It's not the government forcing people to do things. I say they're wonderful. Choice is a great thing. Voluntary credit purchases are exactly what we want. And I've written to every chief executive in Australia, say, look, if you want to sign up to targets, knock yourself out, fantastic. But I tell you what, don't say you're going to do something and then not do it. Australia has met and beaten our Kyoto targets by 459 million tonnes. We'll meet and beat our Paris targets by a long way. We're on track now to get to, point in time, 38% reduction by 2030, which is way ahead of our original Paris commitments. But companies that make similar commitments need to get real about it, and they need to purchase credits. So that's happening now quickly, and they're focusing particularly on farming. And they can sell them. Yep. The farmer gets the income, 100%. And the challenge with this has not been that. There's demand for these credits. The challenge is having a crediting mechanism that is economic for the farmer. And the key barrier to that has been the cost of measurement. So what we've really focused on is bringing down that cost of measurement as aggressively as we can. We're seeing fantastic innovation on this through CSIRO and others, the private sector. We're putting $50 million into what we're calling the National Soil Innovation Challenge, which is to continue to drive down the cost of measuring that soil carbon. If it can be measured at about the same rate that farmers pay now for traditional soil measurement, which is not granular enough for soil carbon, then we're very confident the uptake and credit creation from farmers will expand very quickly. But it's already there. We're seeing credits coming onto the market now. We want to see a lot more.
Thank you. Do I see anyone else here? The gentleman at the back, please, if you Just state name and organisation.
Sorry, I didn't answer the question on Mark Carney. No, I should do that. Mark and I were at Oxford together in the same class doing our MPhil in economics. We're old friends, so I know him well, and I had a chance to catch up with him yesterday. Look, I understand the focus from some on wiping industries out. I think it's the wrong focus. I think the right focus is on bringing the cost of these low emissions technologies down. The rest then sorts itself out. We know that our customers in Japan and Korea, their demand is going to change over time. We're not naive to that in Australia. We completely understand it. And we'll adapt to hydrogen supply chains, ammonia supply chains that can actually meet their needs. We're already doing that, and we're engaged with them very strongly, and I am personally. But the obsession with wiping industries out, that's just not the way we think about the problem. And I don't think it's helpful.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Very interesting talk
Name
this
and
morning.
organisation, please.
Jonathan Baines, London International Investment Office, but I used to be head of GIC, Government of Singapore Investment Corporation Europe, look at infrastructure investment across Europe. The question now for me, just from your talk this morning, is with this movement for communities and areas of labour to the new technologies, do you see that the job opportunities of those communities will transfer from traditional through to the new technologies at the same level of employment? So you're creating the same level of jobs in an area like your area in new technology?
Yes, if it's done right. It depends on the plan. So we've done an enormous amount of work on this, and the conclusion we've come to is if you do this right, and as you're losing exports on one commodity, you're gaining them on another, the overall job creation is a positive. Clean ammonia and clean hydrogen, for instance, and it's probably the best example, is an enormous opportunity for Australia. It's a premium product that our Asian customers in particular, the customers in the Indo-Pacific, want already and are going to need more of. And there's great job creation potential. One of the points I would make on this is that we want them to be productive jobs too. I mean, you can create jobs that are not productive, but at the end of the day, that's bad for your economy. Let's be clear. Someone has to pay the cost of that. Incomes have got to go down somewhere to accept that. We're confident that we can, through evolving with our customers, like any good business. If your customer demand changes, you supply them the product they want. And that's exactly what's happening, and we're very confident that done right, with the investments in the technologies, with the investments in the supply chains we're making now to support that evolution, we can ensure that the jobs that might be lost will be regained in similar industries. There's an element there is a role here for government to make sure in individual areas you're seeing that. You could see some real regional dislocation if you don't manage this carefully, and we're very conscious of that. But I'll give you a good example of it. Our hydrogen hubs and carbon capture and storage hubs, are located in those areas naturally anyway, where we might lose jobs if we don't get this right. Now we're going to get it right, and the hubs we're creating, similar to you're creating a hub at Teesside, for instance, are in areas where we're very confident we can actually grow the total number of jobs, not lose them.
Brilliant, thank you. Gentleman there in the middle, just name an organisation, please.
Yes, Britt Shaw, Chem Energy. What is Australia's position on building out the infrastructure necessary to actually export green hydrogen or any other hydrogen for that point? Or is it much more likely that you anticipate just using the existing infrastructure for ammonia as a way of actually exporting this energy?
The answer is, it's a great question. The answer is both. So there's many parts to this. There's the actual shipping. We're about to ship the first ever shipment in the world across seaborne shipment of liquid hydrogen from Gippsland, which is a big traditional coal region in Victoria, up to Japan. So that's the Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain Project, which is a big project. It's a fantastic example of how this can work, where for every dollar we've put into it, we've seen a total of $10 of investment from private sector and government. And so that shipment is a really good example of making sure we're building the capability, just as we did with LNG. It's very similar, actually. There's a lot of analogies. I mean, ammonia is much easier to ship, but then you're back into the production side, and making sure we have the infrastructure in place so those production hubs can develop quickly is a real priority for us. We've made commitments of well over $1 billion, additional commitments to hydrogen just in the last little while, with a particular focus on getting those hubs established and making sure there's the common user infrastructure that can bring the costs down for everybody who's producing in those regions. Our approach is both blue and green. That means made from both gas with sequestration and from electrolysis and renewables. Both are part of the answer, and getting the costs down will mean being neutral to whatever technology is deployed, as long as you're bringing down your emissions.
Thank you. I see one question come up here online. Guy Elliott, Chairman of Prudence Trust. Guy Elliott, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Could I ask a question about the cost of capital? Do you think that all this investment can be mobilized using traditional capital asset pricing model type approaches, or do you feel that actually we're going to have to be more understanding about that when we make big investment decisions? I think this is the sort of question which is being considered in oil companies at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great question. Great to hear from you, Guy. And of course, you and I have been talking about cost of capital for many years, since before I went into politics. So it's really, really great to hear from you. And it's an important question. I think traditional capital pricing models will work in this environment if the technologies are sufficiently mature. And this is the key. If you think about it in very simple terms, if the technology is as productive or more productive in terms of the cost of providing the energy source, for instance, as a traditional technology, then all the traditional financing techniques will work. There's not a problem with that. Now, I do think in the early stages, as you're getting a technology to cost competitiveness and scale, there's additional risk. There's no question. That's true for any technology. And Guy, you will have seen, some of the challenges with, value adding to iron ore in Western Australia with new technologies. I mean, there's more risk there when you've got those earlier stage technologies. There's a role for government to play to help contain the cost of capital on those projects until these industries get to scale. There's no question about that. And we're doing that through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is, we think, probably the most successful clean energy bank in the world, through ARENA, which is our renewable energy agency. We're doing exactly that to help the private sector to make investments that are economic, that get over hurdle rates using traditional pricing techniques. And we're very cognizant of needing to do that. But I think as you get to scale, I don't think that's necessary. And if I look at solar projects, for instance, in Australia now, the cost has come down so much. It's at a point where traditional capital pricing is absolutely appropriate.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room want to ask a question? Yeah, physically in person. Lady there, name and organisation, please.
Hi, Katrina Kersey, PwC. I wondered what role the government will play in upskilling people to make these initiatives possible.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's something that we've been working on, given a lot of thought to. We've got a broader skills policy, which is not in my portfolio, but part of that is making sure that we have got the skill sets we need. A good example of that is hydrogen is very different to handle to LNG. But we have the skills in Australia. We produce a lot of hydrogen in Australia now already for fertiliser, ammonia nitrate in our petroleum refineries. But making sure we've got enough people with those skills is critical. I don't see this as an exercise in turning a coal miner into a barista, by the way. I mean, this is not what this is about. It's about taking pre-existing skills with relatively minor evolution in those skills that's going to be relevant. Production of traditional LNG versus production of blue hydrogen, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. And so there does need to be upskilling, there's no question about that. But we want to make it as adjacent as it possibly can be for those people moving into these industries.
Thank you. I see two questions online, two final questions. Perhaps we take them as a pair, because I know time is limited today, from Lord Brers and Chris Brannigan. Lord Brers, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to ask a simple question. What storage technologies, in addition to hydrogen, are you pursuing? And are you considering using hydrogen to power road vehicles?
Yeah.
Just to take a second question here. Chris Brannigan, Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange, former Special Advisor to successive Prime Ministers. Chris.
Dean, good morning. Alex, good morning. Across the Indo-Pacific, how do you see Australia establishing a leadership credibility in its green technology as part of an emerging technology alliance? Is there a green version of AUKUS that you might have up your sleeve?
These are all great questions. I'll start with the ones on hydrogen and storage technologies. In terms of hydrogen for transport, absolutely. We see this as starting at the heavy vehicle end. The mining industry uses an enormous amount of diesel. We're already seeing Fortescue, Rio Tinto, BHP working on projects now to use hydrogen in their big mining vehicles. That's at the really big end of town. That'll come down over time to more traditional heavy vehicles on our roads and so on. But we certainly see a very important role for hydrogen at that heavy transport end. On the storage side, yeah, it's another great question. I mean, we've learned in Australia that when you put a lot of solar on people's roofs, your great challenge is dispatchability and storage. I mean, the sun doesn't shine at night. It's a simple statement of fact. Some get offended by that, but it's true. And so you've got to have storage and dispatchability alongside it. Gas, of course, has traditionally played a big role, and it does in the UK grid. But we need, alongside that, other forms of storage. Lithium batteries, of course, for shorter duration storage. They're very expensive for longer duration storage. Hydrogen for the longer duration storage. We're seeing amazing innovation. There was a fantastic business up in Glasgow from Australia that's doing this incredible innovation on storage technologies that can be used by small businesses that combines lithium batteries and hydrogen in a really clever storage technology that supports solar. In particular, pumped hydro, we're doing a major pumped hydro project in Australia, an extra 2.5 gigawatts of that. They're not easy projects, but they're very good projects for storage. And keep in mind, demand management can play a bigger role over time. Our aluminium smelters in particular, we're working with them very closely so they can actually flex more than they traditionally have to provide some of that storage, if you like, at least a sort of virtual kind of storage. On the question on an AUKUS for clean technology in Asia, I think it's a really good question. We need to have diversity of supply chains and we need to have strong collaboration on these technologies across the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is where the action is in terms of emissions. We achieve the global goals there or we don't achieve them at all. It's very, very simple. And we do need energy security. We need a diversity of supply chains. We need to have technologies that are competitive across the region. Being able to source lithium batteries from multiple countries, I think, is going to be very, very important in the coming years. Our collaborations with India, with South Korea, with Japan, and elsewhere is absolutely focused on exactly that point, making sure we've got the technologies coming through that can help those countries to decarbonise and strengthen their economies at the same time.
We like living dangerously at Policy Exchange in policy terms, but also organisationally, and so your near spontaneous visit here is not merely very welcome. I just also want to send say a particular word of thanks to our team here, to Oscar Bickett, to Alexander Gray, to Julia Mizzen and Zoda too for organising this, and to the High Commission team headed so brilliantly by George Brandis, one of the outstanding High Commissioners of our times, and of course a distinguished former Attorney General of Australia. But to thank you, because I say these issues that you've identified are at the forefront of national, international agendas. We'll learn much from what you have to say, the area in Venn diagram terms where there's an overlap and where there isn't an overlap, but you're always welcome here, and we look forward to having you back here with even greater notice next time to address what will still be salient issues here in the months and years to come. Thank you all.